Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. It is your host, Marissa, for another Behind the Binge podcast episode. Today, we are going to be talking about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. A lot of people, when I talk about ADHD, they're like, oh, yeah, I have ADD, or I think I have ADD. And I think there's a big stigma or judgment around the H part of it, the hyperactivity part of it. But if you didn't know, actually, ADD is no longer a diagnosis. It's ADHD with subtypes of the inattentive subtype or the hyperactive subtype. And you can also be a combination of the two. I am a combination type. But also when you think of the hyperactivity part of ADHD, it's not about bouncing off the walls. I am an introvert, so I don't bounce off the walls in like social settings. I'm not the most outgoing person all of the time. But the hyperactivity is the fidgeting, not being able to sit still, picking at my fingernails while I'm on client calls, right? Like I will watch myself. I'll do these time lapses for my TikTok or Instagram or whatever of me working just for putting text over it. And the amount of times that I move around in my chair is astounding. And it very much confirms that I do have the hyperactive part of ADHD, and many people do. So as we're talking about this and we're speaking about ADHD, if you've been diagnosed with ADD in the past or feel like you've had ADD, just know that all of this also applies to you because ADD and ADHD are now the same thing. There's just different subtypes because obviously even a singular diagnosis of anxiety doesn't play out the same for every single person with anxiety. And so having ADHD can include a spectrum of different symptoms. So why are we talking about ADHD? Well, binge eating is actually common enough in ADHDers that some studies suggest screening for binge eating when being diagnosed with ADHD. But it is not just dopamine like many people think. Having ADHD, you could consider that a dopamine deficiency. Dopamine plays a big role in ADHD symptoms and executive dysfunction. And so since food, carbs, sugar, all sorts of different things can increase our dopamine, it makes it seem like it is just simply a dopamine-seeking behavior, going to food in order to meet those dopamine needs as an ADHDer. But it's not just that. Blaming it all on dopamine or impulsivity might lead you to miss what's really going on. Sure, these things may relate to the underlying issue, but what is the problem? Is it itself the problem? What's really behind the binge? A play on words. That's why this podcast is named Behind the Binge. Anyway, let's look at the reasons someone binge eats. And let me start this by saying it is never, N-E-V-E-R, never just about self-control, willpower, or food addiction. Binge eating is an effective way your body adapts to meet unmet needs. This could be physical needs, emotional needs, psychological needs, whatever it might be. If there is an unmet need that is consistently being unmet, there's a lack of reliability in your life or in your body to get those needs met, that is what begins to create this need to binge as a way to get those needs met in some way, whether it is because you actually need more food, like physical needs, you're needing more comfort or to numb from certain emotional needs that are not getting met, or similarly needing to numb, distract, or calm yourself in some way when it comes to certain psychological needs. So let's start with talking about the physical needs because this is the most important and most overlooked factor that contributes to binge eating. Unmet physical needs that lead to binge eating are undereating and basically undereating. Lack of sleep is a physical need that could be related as well, but when it comes to binge eating, most commonly, the physical need not getting met is not eating enough. Now, this could be intentional or unintentional. Intentional undereating would look like dieting in the form of a true diet program of sorts, or even just simply restricting your calories. Unfortunately, even though weight loss advice makes it seem like it is such a simple equation when you're eating under your body's basic needs, it will actually kick into survival mode to get those needs met. Meaning, all logic goes out the window, and your primal hunger is making all of the decisions. Your body tries to save you from starvation by making you think about food, seek food in any way possible, and then overeat when finally given access. And I say starvation, and you might think, oh, Marissa, just me calorie restricting a couple hundred calories is not starvation. Truthfully, your body doesn't know the difference between dieting and starvation. Both are under eating, both are not getting your body's needs met. And depending on, yes, the severity of it, but also how long it goes on for. And if your body is really in a stressed state because of this, it all plays out the same way as starvation would, just maybe at a lesser extreme. Now, when you are in a state of restriction, under eating, you are able to binge or overeat because the fullness hormone, leptin, that usually tells your brain you've had enough food, is suppressed so that you can eat more as a safety mechanism. Even more proof that our bodies are smart. And we've evolved from the old seasons of the feast famine, except the modern day version is restrict binge. And so your body is adapting to that feast famine by saying, well, I don't want you to get full and stop eating when another famine might be around the corner. So I'm going to suppress leptin. So even when your stomach is filled up, we're not going to send that signal to your brain to stop eating. That's why you can sometimes get that sensation where like your belly is physically full. You feel stuffed, yet you're still thinking about and seeking more food. I relate to this. I know this exact feeling. And that is because of leptin being suppressed as a result of undereating. Like I said, not meeting physical needs could also unintentionally happen, which is actually frequent amongst ADHDers. With ADHD, you have lower interoceptive awareness, meaning internal cues. You have a difficult time paying attention to your body's internal cues. Pair this with time blindness, where you have a difficulty estimating how long something might take to do or how much time has passed. It's easy for an ADHDer to forget to eat. This honestly happens to me a lot with lunch when I'm glued into whatever I'm doing with work and next thing I know it's 4 and I haven't eaten since 10 or 11. If this happens every once in a while, it's likely not going to lead to a binge, but when this happens consistently, the same thing happens as what we talked about before in the intentional restriction cycles. Your body adapts to keep you safe because it does not know that this is unintentional or intentional. It doesn't know. All it knows is, hey, we're not consistently getting in enough energy to keep our body not just functioning minimally, but actually functioning in a state where we can thrive and focus on more important things. A lot of my clients say, okay, but even though I may be under eating at meals, wouldn't my binges make up for it? Not necessarily. Your body needs consistent energy throughout the day. So even if you binge at 11 p.m. and it's, let's say, 4,000 calories, it's going to be hard for your body to use those same calories the next day at, let's say, 3 p.m. Marissa editing here, I want to make a little note. When I said it's going to be hard for your body to use those same calories the next day, I want to clarify that your body can use calories from yesterday to fuel today. It's not like your body resets every night. But what I'm saying is if this is a restrict binge cycle and your body is still replenishing from the day before, then no, it's going to have a hard time carrying that over to the next day because it's still already coming out of a deficit. That is why the restrict binge cycle is so difficult because the binges really can't continue to sustain you forward if you haven't been able to sustain yourself previously leading up to the binge. I hope that makes sense. Anyways, continue on past Rosa. So if the next day starts off again without eating enough food, which may happen if you skip meals after a binge, then it's just fueling that cycle. And for many, the binges aren't frequent enough to make the average of your intake enough to sustain you. And over time, your body learns that the only way it can get in enough calories throughout the day is by binging. So again, it continues to feed that cycle of, well, we have to go and binge in the evenings because consistently we're being shown that that's the only time we have the chance to get enough calories in to keep us safe. Now, even if the binges gave you enough food, gave you enough calories, this leads us to the next common reason people binge: food rules. So above physical needs, we have psychological needs like safety and security. Having food rules, restrictions, ways you think you should or should not be eating leads to an insecurity with food. If you want a burger, but you think you should have the salad, so that's what you choose, you're likely going to feel unsatisfied and rebel to seek satisfaction later with a binge. It doesn't even have to be a binge on the thing that you're restricting. In my binge days, I would binge on a stale rice cake from the back of my cabinet, and even one time I drank maple syrup. That is how your body really takes over to say, I need safety and I don't care how I get it. And logically, we might be like, how is maple syrup keeping you safe? But internally and primally, my body's like, any amount of calories in any food makes me feel more safe and secure because we're getting enough quick energy to either prevent the next famine or get it while we can, because it feels like there's an anticipation of restriction coming if we're thinking food restrictive thoughts. Again, this is not a simple choice to eat the stale rice cakes or not eat the stale rice cakes. Your body and mind are designed to keep you safe. So if your circumstances risk that safety, like foods being limited, internally things shift to seek more of those things. It's like a farewell to food feast. When you're about to start a new diet on Monday, so you eat all of the quote unquote not allowed foods on Sunday, or the forbidden fruit phenomenon where once something is deemed off limits, you suddenly want it more. It's amazing the way in which our mind works in this way, and it's not in our direct control to turn it off. We can influence it, but we can't just say, oh, I don't want to think this way, so I'm not going to crave those things or want those things and seek those things. The only way we can control it is by creating safety and security with food again, which means ditching the food rules, normalizing the foods you restricted, and creating unconditional permission to eat. If you're afraid that unconditional permission to eat will just cause you to eat everything and anything, go listen to the podcast that I'm going to link in the show notes on navigating that fear that unconditional permission to eat will just actually cause you to binge or overeat, because there's a lot of nuance to that, and I talk about it in an entire other episode. So I will link that in the show notes. I can't remember which one it is right now off the top of my head, but it's linked there. Hi, Future Marissa editing again. It's actually not a podcast episode. It is a blog post. It's called, Will Having Unconditional Permission to Eat All Foods Cause Me to Binge Eat Forever? I definitely need to make this a podcast episode on exactly this topic. And I know that I've talked about this in many other podcast episodes, so maybe just go binge all my podcast episodes. Haha. But I will link this blog post in the show notes below. Okay, back to this episode. A great example of how permission that creates safety and security with food actually releases your need to binge on these foods and reduces the binges is an example with myself. Seriously, I used to binge on an entire packet of Oreos with an entire jar of peanut butter. Yeah, peanut butter and Oreos are a really great combo. But now an entire packet it's just unfathomable for me to eat that amount because my body doesn't need it. Because all of my needs are getting met. I don't even crave Oreos, and I have way too many variations of nut butters in my pantry that are literally probably expired. I have so many. I need to throw them out. Back in the day, I couldn't have even imagined that. I would eat an entire jar of peanut butter the second it was in my house, so I usually forbid myself from even buying it. But now they are expiring in my pantry because I started eating them every day. I normalized it and reframed my mindset back to feeling okay eating them. Yes, there was a bit of a honeymoon phase, but now nothing has that power over me anymore. So when you open up that permission to eat the Oreos and peanut butter every day if you wanted it, and you truly start to change that mindset from that scarcity and fear around it to a place of acceptance and opening up the unconditional permission to eat them, it loses that novelty. And, you can have it if you want, but you don't really need it or want it all of the time. Okay, back to how this relates to ADHD. It is common for ADHDers to have hyperfixation foods. Right now, for me, it's the same breakfast every day. A waffle with almond butter, a type of fruit on top, and syrup on top. Literally every day. However, wellness culture instills in us that we need variety and color and less carbs, more protein, etc., etc. So we get in our head, should I be switching up what I'm eating? Should I find a way to add veggies in my breakfast? Should I stop eating convenient foods and maybe make the waffles from scratch instead? This dialogue can be paralyzing and even leads to decision fatigue when trying to get something to eat. Gosh, I struggle so much with decision fatigue, and now that I'm planning a wedding, Every day is exhausting when I start thinking about what venue, what flowers, what dress, what decor, oh my God. The decision fatigue is real. ADHDers will eat different than neurotypical people. We may eat less variety, more simple meals, and stick to routines until we get sick of it. That is okay. Fed is best. If you're concerned about your nutrient intake, you can get a blood test for deficiencies and take a supplement to help, or work with a dietitian informed on ADHD to see where you can find things you enjoy to add to what you already love so you can up your nutrient intake a little bit. Our bodies are so cool though, and they're very adaptive, and we can store certain nutrients and create certain nutrients when we are not getting enough of some things, as long as we are generally eating enough. Honestly, for the majority of people, if you're eating enough, you're getting enough of the nutrients you need. You have to be eating enough and plenty of it. So, if you have ADHD and you feel guilt or shame about your hyperfixation foods, so you try to switch it up, why? What would happen if you opened up more permission to eat those foods and add variety if or when you want to or can? Again, fed is always best. Adequacy is always best. Variety doesn't matter if you're not eating enough in general, because you get stuck and annoyed trying to decide what to eat because of all the shoulds and shouldn'ts in your head. Now, if you've checked those two boxes, yes, I am for sure eating plenty of food consistently and adequately based on satiation, not a calorie counting app, because those things don't know you better than you know yourself. And I have not just come off of a diet and previous restriction that I'm healing from. And yes, I have no food rules. I feel at peace with all foods and eat what I want with unconditional permission to listen to my body, but I still binge. Then you might take a closer look at those more commonly blamed emotional needs. Now, in saying that, none of these are independent of the other. They often overlap in many ways, but the point of prioritizing physical needs and safety and security needs is because even if something emotional is leading you to binge as well, if you're not eating enough, no coping tool is going to help. You'll go for the walk and still come back to binge because you need food. I mean, think of hunger, for example. You are more emotional when you're hungry, not the other way around. So when you eat enough, it's much easier to regulate your emotions. I remember being very short-tempered when I was dieting, and still to this day, if I forget to eat lunch or if I accidentally don't eat enough in a day for whatever reason, I can feel that short-temperedness and that, I don't know, just annoyance come over me, and then I realize, maybe I need a snack, and the snack helps. Anyways, with that being said, this is where dopamine may come in. ADHDers are basically in a dopamine deficiency. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter made in your brain. It also acts as a hormone. As a neurotransmitter, it basically communicates from your brain to the rest of your body and back. With this, it's involved in movement, memory, pleasure, reward, motivation, attention, and other things. Those are the primary functions that are impacted for ADHDers. As a hormone, it is involved in fight or flight, which is also when a binge ensues. So dopamine is so much more than just seeking pleasure and reward. So when one is seeking dopamine, maybe from food, it's not just about pleasure. It might be about seeking dopamine for motivation, attention, etc. For example, I could never explain why, but in college, I always had to have chips or popcorn or something with me for a late night study session. Now, after a diagnosis of ADHD and understanding it further, I realized that I was probably using that food in that scenario to give me dopamine for motivation, energy, and concentration. And it worked. Other ways food can be used to provide dopamine is with emotional coping and regulation. Here are some examples. When an ADHD is understimulated, they may binge for stimulation. Overstimulated, binge to numb. Overwhelmed, binge to distract. Underwhelmed, binge to entertain. Big feelings in any way, binge to cope. Procrastinating, binge to activate motivation, or even binge to procrastinate further. And it's tough because food does do all of these things. So it really meets our emotional needs in that way. But it's not effective long term, and then the binge causes more harm. The good news here is understanding when, where, and why you seek food and end up binging will help you determine what else might provide what you're actually looking for in those moments, if it's not actually food or in addition to food. What I mean by this is replacing the impulse to eat with something that also provides a similar effect for your brain, or actually solves the issue at hand, but leaves you feeling better, not worse, which will be rewarding enough to possibly choose the alternative action again in the future. For example, if you usually binge when you're procrastinating, you might find alternative avenues for accountability to jumpstart your motivation. Because once you get started on a task, dopamine begins to fire as you accomplish those tasks. So that way, you're not needing the food because the task itself is sufficient, but only once you've actually started it. So that's where the accountability comes in. Another example might be when you're feeling bored or understimulated, so you turn to food for stimulation. A past client of mine realized that pairing a snack with another stimulating activity was helpful. She could eat to satisfaction and move on because she was satiated and stimulated. So the food doesn't have to go entirely. You can pair it with another stimulating task. An example of some stimulating tasks you can use in this case might be listening to a podcast you enjoy, doing some exercise, or even putting on headphones and blasting your favorite songs. This sounds so much easier said than done, I know, because it's true. It is hard to disrupt your habit of turning to food, especially the first few times you try it. But with repetition and tuning into all the positive effects this new behavior has, you'll naturally want more of it. Is this making sense? It's really nuanced and individualized, but you basically identify your patterns and then brainstorm how else you could meet that need in the future. So if you tend to binge when you get home from work, figure out what you're seeking and think about what else might help. Experiment and give it time. But remember, this only works if you're well-fed and you have a trusting relationship with food. You will always go back to food if your body is needing more food. All right, in summary, if you binge and have ADHD, 1, make sure you're eating enough and don't forget to eat regularly. Set alarms if you have to. Put it in your calendar. Whatever it is you need to remember to check in with yourself in the middle of the day to make sure that you're tuning into that interoceptive awareness, or even just being practical to make yourself lunch because you know it will better serve you for the rest of the day. 2, forget the food rules and adopt unconditional permission to eat. Normalize your fun foods. They can absolutely be part of a healthy life too. And 3, see where food might be filling an emotional need, such as seeking dopamine, and experiment with some alternatives. Obviously, ADHD and binge eating management is so much more complex than I could wrap up in a short podcast episode. So if you are looking for support with this in any way, we would love to help you. One-to-one support can be really beneficial because we get to dive into all of the nuances of your life to make sure that these tips can actually support you. What we're looking at when it's a mother of 3 will be very different than what we're looking at when it comes to a college student. Also, there can be a lot that you can't see for yourself that an outside professional will be able to help you identify. This helps you to get through your binge eating struggles not only faster, but with a lot more clarity because you have someone to help guide the way. So if you're looking to move forward with private coaching, head to behindthebinge.com/private coaching. I will link it in the show notes. Learn all about how one-to-one coaching can work for you. And after you apply, we will get on a free call to make sure that this is the right fit for you. Both that I'm the right fit for you and you're the right fit for me or my associate RD, Livy. I did recently have a webinar on ADHD and binge eating, and I've been thinking about making a full ADHD and binge eating course. If this is something you would be interested in, I would really love to hear that. Either leave a review on this podcast about all that you've been enjoying, what you appreciate, what you like, and then mention there that you would love to see an ADHD and binge eating course, or head over, of course, to Instagram at binge.nutritionist. Send me a DM saying, hey, I would be really interested in the binge eating and ADHD course or whatever. So that way I can know that there's some interest and then move forward in creating something for you. There's just so much to know about ADHD and the way it intersects with binge eating that, it's just hard to kind of consolidate it. Consolidate it? Why does that not sound like a word right now? Anyways, to put it all into one little podcast episode. So I definitely want to dive into this more, especially since it is something that I myself have struggled with. And of course, I still continue to have ADHD. All right. That sounded like Matthew McConaughey. All right. That is the end of this episode. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope that you tune in again next Friday. It was a pleasure talking to all of you. And I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.